So you all should have some paper or index card, and hopefully you wrote some things down that will be difficult and challenging for me to answer. I hope you want to see me struggle and be befuddled and confused. So, I think we got some of them picked up. And anybody have? Okay. Others. And if you want to write something while I'm talking, feel free to do that. So that just sort of looking at this. Okay. I'm just taking a look at these, make sure there's nothing too crazy in here that I'm all right. All right, I'm going to go with this one first because I think it's kind of funny. Thank you. We assume you are happy at the co-op. Why? Followed by 3 question marks. Okay, fair enough. Why am I? I am happy at the co-op. I think there are several reasons why. First of all, and this came up a couple of times in conversation. I think it came up with the outreach group that we've had. This is one of the most sort of religiously diverse congregations I've ever been in. I mean, people's beliefs, where they come from, what it's rooted in, what it's not rooted in. People here are kind of on a journey, not really sure where it's coming from or where it's going necessarily, but people are very much on a journey, and that for me is very interesting and exciting, and I'm always fascinated and drawn in by those kinds of conversations. So that is definitely a part of it. And I like that this is a congregation that, all congregations are generally conservative in the sense that they're trying to conserve a thing. They're there to preserve a thing in a lot of ways. But also, churches are very much about transformation. And this congregation is used to experiments and used to change, and compared to a lot of congregations that I've been in or been associated with or heard of or whatever. And that is wonderful, because I think that is a way forward, a way to understand what God is unfolding for the church in the future. And a lot of that is a product of your history. A lot of it is a product of the fact that you are 2 different denominations that came together. It's not like, it wasn't 2 completely different faiths or something like that. Lutherans and Methodists share a lot in common. But there are also a lot of people here who are neither Lutheran or Methodist too. Lutheran or Methodist, and that they fit in and feel a part of this community is really important. And then I think your openness or your desire to see the world changed for the sake of the kingdom, for the sake of justice, and your willingness to be involved in feeding people, but also being involved in protests and being involved in going to Salem and trying to influence people in legislation to change the world for the better is very important, I think, for most people who are here, I think, and one of the reasons that keeps you here. So there were 3 question marks, so there's 3 answers. How long and what kind of process did it take to project your voice? This is opera themed. I'm still learning. There's like most endeavors that involve some sort of human talent or ability, it's just practice is a huge part of it, but also working with people who can give you good advice on how to go better, how to be better. There's that book that came out some years ago. It's like 10,000 hours, 10,000 hours to master anything. the thing that's my understanding is the thing that's kind of left out of our colloquial understanding of what that means is mentors, teachers, experts, people who can help you fix the things that you're doing wrong. It's not just, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it for 10,000 hours and I'll get better. Well, maybe a little bit, but if you don't have someone else helping you and helping you know where your failures are, and helping you in singing, especially helping you to discover and understand your voice, you're not gonna, because it's not true to you, and so you need that as a part of it. So, and that's not always a pleasant experience. I can tell you that. And not all the people who are pleasant are really good at what they're doing. So sometimes you have to go to people who are not pleasant to really learn. Let's see. Well, this is interesting. Okay. With a common understanding of U.S. Christianity feeling like it is often about purity, judgment, and exclusion, how can we make our voices heard as we understand Jesus' message to be one of love, healing, and compassion for all, especially those on the margins? It is just so discouraging sometimes. Yeah, it is discouraging. I don't know how to solve the problem, because if I did, I would have done it already. I'll just say that. It is a conundrum. I mean, this is kind of playful and kind of not. I'm not sure Christianity ever made it to the United States. The kind of Christianity that made it to the United States is in some ways unrooted from the Christianity that you found even in Europe. And I think you see that in the way Europe has preserved the kind of what colloquially we call, the social safety net, taking care of people who who are struggling to make it through life or struggling to make it through the systems that we have set up that provide for success. And I think that's because Christianity had some real roots and reality in Europe in the way that I don't know if it ever made to America, because we didn't even have Social Security until the 60s. There was a real, the idea of freedom in America is, thanks, I don't need your help sometimes. But I also think in the midst of a society that's very polarized, in which I show my what kind of a good person I am by disassociating myself from those kinds of people, and that's on both sides. In some ways, the core of American social life these days seems to be one of purity, judgment, and exclusion. We call that polarization. And so we, as a country, make our lives, our shared lives together, not one of, what was the other one? This is really good. Love, healing, and compassion. We make it of accusation, of judgment, and purity, and exclusion. So when that's such a huge part of our shared cultural life together, the message of love and compassion and healing isn't particularly interesting, because that's just not what we're doing and that's not what we're about. So a Christianity that plays into that is always going to be louder, because it sounds normal. And a Christianity that reaches across those kinds of divides can be seen as, sometimes it's just seen as not tough enough or not pure enough, or maybe even in league with the wrong people. So, I think that's a part of it. But yes, I find it very discouraging as well. So, sorry for the downer. Do you think evangelical Christian apologists such as Dr. William Lane Craig and Frank Tivek provide more benefit or harm towards Christianity? I don't know who Frank Tivek is. I'm a little familiar with Dr. Lane Craig. I I don't have a lot of common theologically with Dr. William Lane Craig, so I'm not a fan of most of his theology or his arguments. So I don't know if it's a benefit or not, but it's hard to, if it allows someone to take a look at following Jesus when at first they rejected it, there's that woman, I'm trying to remember the story in Acts, where there's a woman who's going around saying, these men are the followers of the true Christ. And she's doing that. She had a demon or something like that. She was like people used to come and she was like clairvoyant. And so the gods would speak to her, the spirits would speak to her. And then Paul comes there and they follow around. These men are speaking the truth. You need to listen to what they say. And Paul casts the demon out, and it irritates everyone. So I don't know. I'm trying to think about stories that like have that kind of if they're not against us, are they for us? So when I think about someone who is I would say probably is a Christian, even though we have very, very different views, like I don't know if they're a benefit or a harm. In some ways, I think they might be a harm because they're making kind of bad arguments about a bad idea of God, or a impoverished view of God. But some people start their journey there. We all start our journey in weird places. So don't know if that's a helpful answer, but that's where I'm coming down at. What was a defining moment when you decided to become a pastor? I could tell you a nice story that would have a nice shape to it, and at the climax I would have had my defining moment, but my life isn't like that. Paul is riding to Damascus and he gets knocked off of his mule, and Jesus appears to him, and that sort of. Matthias was just like a schmuck, and in a roll of the dice he replaced Judas. I don't know if you know that story. Sometimes I feel a little bit more like Matthias than Paul. There's a lot of different things, a lot of small and large things about my interests, about conversations that I had with people who are pastors. So there were a lot of like small ticks along the way that eventually kind of came to a decision to enter seminary, or really to like explore this and sit down with people that I knew and trusted and say, I'm thinking of doing this, what do you think about it? And the response was overwhelmingly positive. And so that sort of, okay, I'm going to begin this journey. And I guess the defining moment when I decided I was going to be a pastor is probably the day of my ordination, because that was the end of the journey. I mean, it was just, I guess, here we are. There's no going back now. But it's, it's not always, in fact, and I think, you've got Matthew here and Cecily, people who are all on this journey, different people have been along this journey. I think most of them would say that. There are some big events that might happen, but it's mostly a lot of small events, I think. Okay, here's a good one. Here we go. I've always been bothered by the mentions of God hardened Pharaoh's heart in the Exodus. It seems contrary to God's heart towards choice. Could you speak to that? Yeah, I could speak to that. So in Exodus with the 10 plagues, there are a couple plagues. So the ask is Moses goes, our God, Yahweh, wants you to let these people go. They want to go out and worship me. Excuse me. And Pharaoh's like, no, I'm not going to do that. And so there are these sort of 10 plagues. And the first couple plagues happen, and Pharaoh relents. And then Moses comes and says, yes, you're going to let us go. And Pharaoh hardened his heart. And it happens like 4 or 5 times. And then the same thing happens. There's a plague, and Pharaoh's like, oh my gosh, get these people out of here. And Moses comes to them, and it says, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So the first couple of times, Pharaoh hardened his heart, and then later, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. So, what that tells me, let me go back. It would be a mistake to think of this event as a historic event by which we are to derive some historically a historical event that tells us definitively something about what God did. That's not the point of these stories. That's not what these stories are trying to do. And it's not the way the people who interpreted these stories. So it is a story. If you remember going back to Abraham and Isaac, God says, "Oh, I want you to sacrifice your son," and he takes him out there and da da da. Why is this? Like, is God just some kind of terrible monster? I mean, it's a monstrous thing to do to someone. A monstrous thing to do to someone. I mean, if a parent did that to a child, right? It would be all over the news. Parent convinces daughter to sacrifice younger brother. No, right? Why is this story here? Because stories are about showing, not telling. I could tell you Abraham had great faith, or I could show you by telling you a story about how great Abraham's faith was. Well, did Abraham really do that? Did God really do that? No, you're confused about the point of the story. Okay? This isn't to say God acted in history to harden Pharaoh's heart. What I hear that is, and there's a lot of different ways of looking at this, when you begin down a path, there are ways back up that path, but at some point the ground just gets too slippery and too steep and you're not getting back up there. Anyone ever been rim-rocked before? You probably haven't been rim-rocked. That's terrifying. You know what being rim-rocked is? When you're climbing down something, or maybe climbing up, but usually climbing down, and you realize you're at a spot where you can't go down any further and you can't climb back up where you came down. Right? And then you need a helicopter to come in and rescue you, or someone with ropes or something like that, right? So this is a story about when you start down a path, sometimes you get down that path and there's no way to go back. Right? And that story, and this is the direction we're going. So when God hardens Pharaoh's heart, I mean, there are a lot of ways to understand that. But when we take it within the story, it means that Pharaoh has done enough that now God hasn't had time yet to defeat all of the great Egyptian deities. And so now God is going to make sure that he gets a chance to show everyone that he's much bigger than all of the Egyptian deities, which is the subtext of all of those plagues and what happens in those plagues. Now, is that what happened in history? What does that say about, I don't know. This isn't a news story. This is a story. And we need to read this and interpret this as, now, is it somehow based in history? Is it anchored in history in some way? Maybe. Depends on which archaeologists you talk to and how they understand things and how they understand ancient Egyptian texts and all kinds of stuff. That's a very different story. The question is, how do we interpret it? And then I think also, as Christians, our great tradition is, where do we see or hear Christ in this story? I'm not sure. I have to think about that a little bit more. But that's always the question we're asking. Where is the story of Jesus in harmony and resonant with this story that we hear? So I'd have to think about that a little bit more, and I'd have to maybe read it in its context to get a sense of that. So, what can be learned from the way Jesus treated women in the Bible? So what can be learned from the way Jesus treated women in the Bible? Almost nothing, maybe. I don't know. Jesus didn't treat with women very much. Jesus went and sits with a Samaritan woman at the well, which would have been unusual. Jesus was supported by women quite a bit. A couple of them are named in Luke. So women who had means, and particularly widows, were able to support Jesus' ministry. There's always a Syrophoenician woman who's kind of the one woman who kind of gets one over on Jesus. When he's like, my daughter's sick. He's like, I came here for the children of Israel, not for the Gentiles. You don't give what is for the children to the dogs. And she says, well, the dogs get to eat. Kids are terrible at putting stuff off the table, and the dogs eat it, right? And so he's like, well, he doesn't go to her house, but he says your daughter is healed. So, I would, you can read the New Testament through a feminist lens. I don't know how far you really get with that, because you just don't have a big picture. And I wouldn't say that Jesus treats everyone with gentleness and compassion, because Jesus doesn't do that, which is another question to be asked. But I wouldn't look I would look to the New Testament to understand how to treat everyone. Because going back to Paul, what Paul says about there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, there's neither male and female anymore, right? That's how they understood what Jesus was doing with all of humanity. That in Christ we are all one, we are all the same, we are all of equal dignity and should be treated as such. And that to me is the starting point. And so I would say that you should probably treat women that way. What Paul and Jesus, especially in John, are saying is we are all filled with the divine. John chapter 1, right? At the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. The Word became flesh, right? And became the Son of God, the one unique Son of God, the only begotten Son of God. Why? So that we might all become children of God, born not of flesh or the will of a man, but of the will of God. So we have Jesus, the Son of God, and then all of us who are also children of God. What kind of children does God have? Sons, daughters, right? So that passage is connecting us with Jesus. So there's a real sort of sense of there is this divinity within all of us. And what is being awakened and what is unfolding is this divine within us that is filling us in the way that the burning bush is filled with fire and is not consumed. So you should treat women as if they are divine. And you should also treat men as if they were divine. Ways to stay calm. That's a good question. There's probably some behavioral psychologists who would give you some better advice. Breathe. Make sure you're breathing deeply. And I don't mean like this, but breathe into your belly. I read somewhere you take 3 deep breaths and it's supposed to calm you down. Go for a walk. I always find walking very calming. Some people find listening to music calming. Generally, you don't need to rush into things. And turn to your faith and the promises that God has made. So I don't know, there are lots of, what is calm? Is calm just a general attitude about life? Or is it whenever something terrible happens, how do you react to it? But so in the immediate, pay attention to your body. What is your body doing? I don't know. Can you even think about that when things are not calm, though? So hopefully that's not empty advice. While I'm here, any others floating out that anyone's written anything? Okay. If you had access to only one book of the Bible, which one would you choose? I don't know. That's a good question. That would be hard to decide. I don't even know why I would do that. This feels like one of those sort of would you rather questions. Would you rather be sticky all the time or itchy all the time? I don't know. Just kind of. I like the Gospel of John. I think that the Gospel of John has a lot of it has a lot of depth and it's multifaceted in a lot of ways and has a lot of opportunities for meditation, and I think it would go a long way. That would go for the letters of John too. I really like Genesis a lot. Obviously, I like 1 Corinthians quite a bit. So I don't know. Sorry. I don't know. That's a hard question. If you want to know, what is a book of the Bible I should read, ask me, so I know who's asking, and maybe I'll have some advice based on what I know of you. What are a couple of the most personally uplifting verses from the Bible for you? There's one, actually, I think it kind of inspired this stole. Psalm chapter 60, or is it 65? Ooh. The river of God is full of water. It's kind of a pastoral psalm. and it talks about the sheep on the hillside and grain in the fields and all that stuff. But there's this passage, the river of God is full of water. And that's actually about remaining calm or finding hope or whatever. Because I think our fear of scarcity is a fear that drives a lot of our fears. And that to me is a passage that speaks about God's provision and God's abundance. That we tend to look at, and it's not really a question of like, is the glass half empty or half full? I mean, the water in the glass is the water in the glass. But it says the river's full of water. It's absolutely full of water. And that's something that has really struck me when I read it some years ago, and it stayed with me. So that's all the questions. Thank you. Good. We'll have a song now.